Chapter 3 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 3. Sunday at Mrs. Mason's. Mr. Bellingham attended afternoon service at St. Nicholas's Church the next Sunday. His thoughts had been far more occupied by Ruth than hers by him, although his appearance upon the scene of her life was more an event to her than it was to him. He was puzzled by the impression she had produced on him, though he did not in general analyze the nature of his feelings, but simply enjoyed them with the delight which youth takes in experiencing new and strong emotion. He was old compared to Ruth, but young as a man, hardly 23. The fact of his being an only child had given him, as it does to many, a sort of inequality in those parts of the character which are usually formed by the number of years that a person has lived. The unevenness of discipline to which only children are subjected, the thwarting resulting from over-anxiety, the indiscreet indulgence arising from a love centred all in one object, had been exaggerated in his education, probably from the circumstance that his mother, his only surviving parent, had been similarly situated to himself. He was already in possession of the comparatively small property he inherited from his father. The estate on which his mother lived was her own, and her income gave her the means of indulging or controlling him, after he had grown to man's estate, as her wayward disposition and her love of power prompted her. Had he been double-dealing in his conduct towards her, had he condescended to humour her in the least, her passionate love for him would have induced her to strip herself of all her possessions to add to his dignity or happiness. But although he felt the warmest affection for her, the regardlessness which she had taught him, by example perhaps more than by precept, of the feelings of others, was continually prompting him to do things that she, for the time being, resented as mortal affronts. He would mimic the clergyman she specially esteemed, even to his very face. He would refuse to visit her schools for months and months, and when wearied into going at last, revenge himself by puzzling the children with the most ridiculous questions, gravely put, that he could imagine. All these boyish tricks annoyed and irritated her far more than the accounts which reached her of more serious misdoings at college and in town. Of these grave offences she never spoke; of the smaller misdeeds she hardly ever ceased speaking. Still, at times, she had great influence over him, and nothing delighted her more than to exercise it. The submission of his will to hers was sure to be liberally rewarded, for it gave her great happiness to extort from his indifference or his affection the concessions which she never sought by force of reason, or by appeals to principle, concessions which he frequently withheld solely for the sake of asserting his independence of her control. She was anxious for him to marry Miss Duncombe. She cared little or nothing about it. It was time enough to be married 10 years hence, and so he was dawdling through some months of his life, sometimes flirting with the nothing loth Miss Duncombe, sometimes plaguing and sometimes delighting his mother, at all times taking care to please himself. When he first saw Ruth Hilton, and a new, passionate, hearty feeling shot through his whole being. He did not know why he was so fascinated by her. She was very beautiful, but he had seen many more agaceries calculated to set off the effect of their charms. There was, perhaps, something bewitching in the union of the grace and loveliness of womanhood with the naivete, simplicity, and innocence of an intelligent child. There was a spell in the shyness which made her avoid and shun all admiring approaches to acquaintance. It would be an exquisite delight to attract and tame her wildness, just as he had often allured and tamed the timid fawns in his mother's park. By no overbold admiration or rash, passionate word would he startle her, and surely in time she might be induced to look upon him as a friend, if not something nearer and dearer still. In accordance with this determination, he resisted the strong temptation of walking by her side the whole distance home after church. He only received the intelligence she brought respecting the panel with thanks, spoke a few words about the weather, bowed, and was gone. Ruth believed she should never see him again, and, in spite of sundry self-upbraidings for her folly, she could not help feeling as if a shadow were drawn over her existence for several days to come. Mrs. Mason was a widow, and had to struggle for the sake of the 6 or 7 children left dependent on her exertions. Thus there was some reason, and great excuse, for the pinching economy which regulated her household affairs. On Sundays she chose to conclude that all her apprentices had friends who would be glad to see them to dinner, and give them a welcome reception for the remainder of the day, while she and those of her children who were not at school went to spend the day at her father's house, several miles out of the town. Accordingly, no dinner was cooked on Sundays for the young workwomen. No fires were lighted in any of the rooms to which they had access. On this morning they breakfasted in Mrs. Mason's own parlour, after which the room was closed against them through the day by some understood though unspoken prohibition. What became of such as Ruth, who had no home and no friends in that large, populous, desolate town? She had hitherto commissioned the servant who went to market on Saturdays for the family, to buy her a bun or biscuit, whereon she made her fasting dinner in the deserted workroom, sitting in her walking dress to keep off the cold, which clung to her in spite of the shawl and bonnet. Then she would sit at the window, looking out on the dreary prospect, till her eyes were often blinded by tears, and partly to shake off thoughts and recollections, the indulgence in which she felt to be productive of no good, and partly to have some ideas to dwell upon during the coming week beyond those suggested by the constant view of the same room. She would carry her Bible, and place herself upon the window-seat on the wide landing, which commanded the street in front of the house. From thence she could see the irregular grandeur of the place. She caught a view of the grey church tower, rising hoary and massive into mid-air. She saw 1 or 2 figures loiter along on the sunny side of the street, in all the enjoyment of their fine clothes and Sunday leisure, and she imagined histories for them, and tried to picture to herself their homes and their daily doings. And before long the bells swung heavily in the church tower, and struck out with musical clang the first summons to afternoon church. After church was over, she used to return home to the same window-seat, and watch till the winter twilight was over and gone, and the stars came out over the black masses of houses. And then she would steal down to ask for a candle, as a companion to her in the deserted workroom. Occasionally the servant would bring her up some tea, but of late Ruth had declined taking any, as she had discovered she was robbing the kind-hearted creature of part of the small provision left out for her by Mrs. Mason. She sat on, hungry and cold, trying to read her Bible, and to think the old holy thoughts which had been her childish meditations at her mother's knee, until, one after another, the apprentices returned, weary with their day's enjoyment and their week's late watching, too weary to make her in any way a partaker of their pleasure by entering into details of the manner in which they had spent their day. And last of all Mrs. Mason returned, and summoning her young people once more into the parlour, she read a prayer before dismissing them to bed. She always expected to find them all in the house when she came home, but asked no questions as to their proceedings through the day, perhaps because she dreaded to hear that one or two had occasionally nowhere to go, and that it would be sometimes necessary to order a Sunday's dinner, and leave a lighted fire on that day. For 5 months Ruth had been an inmate at Mrs. Mason's, and such had been the regular order of the Sundays. While the forewoman stayed there, it is true, she was ever ready to give Ruth the little variety of hearing of recreations in which she was no partaker; and however tired Jenny might be at night, she had ever some sympathy to bestow on Ruth for the dull length of day she had passed. After her departure, the monotonous idleness of the Sundays seemed worse to bear than the incessant labour of the work-days, until the time came when it seemed to be a recognised hope in her mind, that on Sunday afternoons she should see Mr. Bellingham, and hear a few words from him as from a friend who took an interest in her thoughts and proceedings during the past week. Ruth's mother had been the daughter of a poor curate in Norfolk, and, early left without parents or home, she was thankful to marry a respectable farmer a good deal older than herself. After their marriage, however, everything seemed to go wrong. Mrs. Hilton fell into a delicate state of health, and was unable to bestow the ever watchful attention to domestic affairs so requisite in a farmer's wife. Her husband had a series of misfortunes, of a more important kind than the death of a whole brood of turkeys from getting among the nettles, or the year of bad cheeses spoilt by a careless dairymaid, which were the consequences, so the neighbours said, of Mr. Hilton's mistake in marrying a delicate fine lady. His crops failed, his horses died, his barn took fire. In short, if he had been in any way a remarkable character, one might have supposed him to be the object of an avenging fate, so successive were the evils which pursued him. But, as he was only a somewhat commonplace farmer, I believe we must attribute his calamities to some want in his character of the one quality required to act as keystone to many excellences. While his wife lived, all worldly misfortunes seemed as nothing to him. Her strong sense and lively faculty of hope upheld him from despair. Her sympathy was always ready, and the invalid's room had an atmosphere of peace and encouragement which affected all who entered it. But when Ruth was about 12, one morning in the busy hay-time, Mrs. Hilton was left alone for some hours. This had often happened before, nor had she seemed weaker than usual when they had gone forth to the field; but on their return, with merry voices, to fetch the dinner prepared for the haymakers, they found an unusual silence brooding over the house. No low voice called out gently to welcome them, and ask after the day's progress; and on entering the little parlour, which was called Mrs. Hilton's, and was sacred to her, they found her lying dead on her accustomed sofa. Quite calm and peaceful she lay. There had been no struggle at last; the struggle was for the survivors, and one sank under it. Her husband did not make much ado at first, at least not in outward show. Her memory seemed to keep in check all external violence of grief; but day by day, dating from his wife's death, his mental powers decreased. He was still a hale-looking elderly man, and his bodily health appeared as good as ever; but he sat for hours in his easy-chair, looking into the fire, not moving, nor speaking, unless when it was absolutely necessary to answer repeated questions. If Ruth, with coaxings and draggings, induced him to come out with her, he went with measured steps around his fields, his head bent to the ground with the same abstracted, unseeing look, never smiling, never changing the expression of his face, not even to one of deeper sadness, when anything occurred which might be supposed to remind him of his dead wife. But in this abstraction from all outward things his worldly affairs went even lower down. He paid money away, or received it, as if it had been so much water. The gold mines of Potosi could not have touched the deep grief of his soul. But God in his mercy knew the sure balm, and sent the beautiful messenger to take the weary one home. After his death, the creditors were the chief people who appeared to take any interest in the affairs, and it seemed strange to Ruth to see people whom she scarcely knew, examining and touching all that she had been accustomed to consider as precious and sacred. Her father had made his will at her birth. With the pride of newly and late acquired paternity, he had considered the office of guardian to his little darling as one which would have been an additional honour to the Lord Lieutenant of the county; but, as he had not the pleasure of his lordship's acquaintance, he selected the person of most consequence among those whom he did know; not any very ambitious appointment in those days of comparative prosperity. But certainly the flourishing maltster of Skelton was a little surprised when, 15 years later, he learnt that he was executor to a will bequeathing many vanished hundreds of pounds, and a guardian to a young girl whom he could not remember ever to have seen. He was a sensible, hard-headed man of the world, having a very fair proportion of conscience, as consciences go. Indeed, perhaps more than many people, for he had some ideas of duty extending to the circle beyond his own family, and did not, as some would have done, decline acting altogether, but speedily summoned the creditors, examined into the accounts, sold up the farming stock, and discharged all the debts, paid about £80 into the Skelton Bank for a week, while he inquired for a situation or apprenticeship of some kind for poor heartbroken Ruth. Heard of Mrs Mason's, arranged all with her in 2 short conversations, drove over for Ruth in his gig, waited while she and the old servant packed up her clothes, and grew very impatient while she ran, with her eyes streaming with tears, round the garden, tearing off in a passion of love whole boughs of favourite china and damask roses, late flowering against the casement window of what had been her mother's room. When she took her seat in the gig, she was little able, even if she had been inclined, to profit by her guardian's lectures on economy and self-reliance. But she was quiet and silent, looking forward with longing to the night time, when, in her bedroom, she might give way to all her passionate sorrow at being wrenched from the home where she had lived with her parents, in that utter absence of any anticipation of change, which is either the blessing or the curse of childhood. But at night there were 4 other girls in her room, and she could not cry before them. She watched and waited till one by one they dropped off to sleep, and then she buried her face in the pillow and shook with sobbing grief. And then she paused to conjure up, with fond luxuriance, every recollection of the happy days, so little valued in their uneventful peace while they lasted, so passionately regretted when once gone for ever, to remember every look and word of the dear mother, and to moan afresh over the change caused by her death, the first clouding in of Ruth's day of life. It was Jenny's sympathy on this first night, when awakened by Ruth's irrepressible agony, that had made the bond between them. But Ruth's loving disposition, continually sending forth fibres in search of nutriment, found no other object for regard among those of her daily life to compensate for the want of natural ties. But, almost insensibly, Jenny's place in Ruth's heart was filled up. There was someone who listened with tender interest to all her little revelations, who questioned her about her early days of happiness, and, in return, spoke of his own childhood, not so golden in reality as Ruth's, but more dazzling, when recounted with stories of the beautiful cream-coloured Arabian pony, and the old picture gallery in the house, and avenues, and terraces, and fountains in the garden, for Ruth to paint, with all the vividness of imagination, as scenery and background for the figure which was growing by slow degrees most prominent in her thoughts. It must not be supposed that this was effected all at once, though the intermediate stages have been passed over. On Sunday, Mr. Bellingham only spoke to her to receive the information about the panel, nor did he come to St. Nicholas's the next, nor yet the following Sunday. But the third he walked by her side a little way, and seeing her annoyance, he left her, and then she wished for him back again, and found the day very dreary, and wondered why a strange, undefined feeling had made her imagine she was doing wrong in walking alongside of one so kind and good as Mr. Bellingham. It had been very foolish of her to be self-conscious all the time, and if ever he spoke to her again, she would not think of what people might say, but enjoy the pleasure which his kind words and evident interest in her might give. Then she thought it was very likely he would never notice her again, for she knew she had been very rude with her short answer. It was very provoking that she had behaved so rudely. She would be 16 in another month, and she was still childish and awkward. Thus she lectured herself after parting with Mr. Bellingham, and the consequence was, that on the following Sunday she was 10 times as blushing and conscious, and, Mr. Bellingham thought, 10 times more beautiful than ever. He suggested that instead of going straight home through High Street, she should take the round by the Leasos. At first she declined, but then, suddenly wondering and questioning herself why she refused a thing which was, as far as reason and knowledge, her knowledge, went, so innocent, and which was certainly so tempting and pleasant, she agreed to go the round, and, when she was once in the meadows that skirted the town, she forgot all doubt and awkwardness, nay, almost forgot the presence of Mr. Bellingham, in her delight at the new tender beauty of an early spring day in February. Among the last year's brown ruins, heaped together by the wind in the hedgerows, she found the fresh, green, crinkled leaves and pale, star-like flowers of the primroses. Here and there a golden celandine made brilliant the sides of the little brook that, full of water, in February Fildike, bubbled along by the side of the path. The sun was low in the horizon, and once, when they came to a higher part of the Leasos, Ruth burst into an exclamation of delight at the evening glory of mellow light which was in the sky behind the purple distance, while the brown leafless woods in the foreground derived an almost metallic lustre from the golden mist and haze of sunset. It was but 3/4 of a mile round by the meadows, but somehow it took them an hour to walk it. Ruth turned to thank Mr. Bellingham for his kindness in taking her home by this beautiful way, but his look of admiration at her glowing, animated face made her suddenly silent, and hardly wishing him good-bye, she quickly entered the house with a beating, happy, agitated heart. How strange it is, she thought that evening, that I should feel as if this charming afternoon's walk were, somehow, not exactly wrong, but yet as if it were not right. Why can it be? I am not defrauding Mrs. Mason of any of her time. That I know would be wrong. I am left to go where I like on Sundays. I have been to church, so it can't be because I have missed doing my duty. If I had gone this walk with Jenny, I wonder whether I should have felt as I do now. There must be something wrong in me, myself, to feel so guilty when I have done nothing which is not right. And yet I can thank God for the happiness I have had in this charming spring walk, which dear mamma used to say was a sign when pleasures were innocent and good for us." She was not conscious, as yet, that Mr. Bellingham's presence had added any charm to the ramble; and when she might have become aware of this, as week after week, Sunday after Sunday, loitering ramble after loitering ramble succeeded each other, she was too much absorbed with one set of thoughts to have much inclination for self-questioning. "Tell me everything, Ruth, as you would to a brother. Let me help you, if I can, in your difficulties," he said to her one afternoon. And he really did try to understand, and to realise how an insignificant and paltry person like Mason the dressmaker could be an object of dread, and regarded as a person having authority, by Ruth. He flamed up with indignation when, by way of impressing him with Mrs. Mason's power and consequence, Ruth spoke of some instance of the effects of her employer's displeasure. He declared his mother should never have a gown made again by such a tyrant, such a Mrs. Brownrigg; that he would prevent all his acquaintances from going to such a cruel dressmaker; till Ruth was alarmed at the threatened consequences of her one-sided account, and pleaded for Mrs. Mason as earnestly as if a young man's menace of this description were likely to be literally fulfilled. "Indeed, sir, I have been very wrong. If you please, sir, don't be so angry. She is often very good to us, and it is only sometimes she goes into a passion, and we are very provoking, I dare say. I know I am, for one. I have often to undo my work, and you can't think how it spoils anything, particularly silk, to be unpicked, and Mrs. Mason has to bear all the blame. Oh, I am sorry I said anything about it. Don't speak to your mother about it, pray, sir. Mrs. Mason thinks so much of Mrs. Bellingham's custom." "Well, I won't this time," recollecting that there might be some awkwardness in accounting to his mother for the means by which he had obtained his very correct information as to what passed in Mrs. Mason's workroom. "But if she ever does so again, I'll not answer for myself." "I will take care and not tell again, sir," said Ruth, in a low voice. "Nay, Ruth, you are not going to have secrets from me, are you? Don't you remember your promise to consider me as a brother? Go on telling me everything that happens to you. Pray, you cannot think how much interest I take in all your interests. I can quite fancy that charming home at Milham you told me about last Sunday. I can almost fancy Mrs. Mason's workroom, and that surely is a proof either of the strength of my imagination or of your powers of description." Ruth smiled. "It is indeed, sir. Our workroom must be so different to anything you ever saw. I think you must have passed through Milham often on your way to Lowford." "Then don't you think it is any stretch of fancy to have so clear an idea as I have of Milham Grange, on the left hand of the road, is it, Ruth?" "Yes, sir, just over the bridge, and up the hill where the elm trees meet overhead and make a green shade, and then comes the dear old Grange, that I shall never see again." "Never? Nonsense, Ruthie! It is only 6 miles off. You may see it any day. It is not an hour's ride." "Perhaps I may see it again when I am grown old. I did not think exactly what 'never' meant. It is so very long since I was there, and I don't see any chance of my going for years and years at any rate." "Why, Ruth, we may go next Sunday afternoon, if you like." She looked up at him with a lovely light of pleasure in her face at the idea. "How, sir? Can I walk it between afternoon service and the time Mrs. Mason comes home? I would go for only one glimpse. But if I could get into the house, oh, sir, if I could just see mamma's room again!" He was revolving plans in his head for giving her this pleasure, and he had also his own in view. If they went in any of his carriages, the loitering charm of the walk would be lost, and they must, to a certain degree, be encumbered by and exposed to the notice of servants. "Are you a good walker, Ruth? Do you think you can manage 6 miles? If we set off at 2 o'clock, we shall be there by 4, without hurrying, or say 4:30. Then we might stay 2 hours, and you could show me all the old walks and old places you love, and we could still come leisurely home. Oh, it's all arranged directly." "But do you think it would be right, sir? It seems as if it would be such a great pleasure, that it must in some way be wrong." "Why, you little goose, what can be wrong in it?" "In the first place, I miss going to church by setting out at 2," said Ruth, a little gravely. "Only for once. Surely you don't see any harm in missing church for once. You will go in the morning, you know." "I wonder if Mrs Mason would think it right, if she would allow it." "No, I dare say not. But you don't mean to be governed by Mrs Mason's notions of right and wrong. She thought it right to treat that poor girl Palmer in the way you told me about. You would think that wrong, you know, and so would every one of sense and feeling. Come, Ruth, don't pin your faith on any one, but judge for yourself. The pleasure is perfectly innocent. It is not a selfish pleasure either, for I shall enjoy it to the full as much as you will. I shall like to see the places where you spent your childhood. I shall almost love them as much as you do." He had dropped his voice, and spoke in low, persuasive tones. Ruth hung down her head, and blushed with exceeding happiness, but she could not speak, even to urge her doubts afresh. Thus it was in a manner settled. How delightfully happy the plan made her through the coming week! She was too young when her mother died to have received any cautions or words of advice respecting the subject of a woman's life, if indeed wise parents ever directly speak of what, in its depth and power, cannot be put into words, which is a brooding spirit with no definite form or shape that men should know it, but which is there and present before we have recognised and realised its existence. Ruth was innocent and snow pure. She had heard of falling in love, but did not know the signs and symptoms thereof, nor indeed had she troubled her head much about them. Sorrow had filled up her days, to the exclusion of all lighter thoughts than the consideration of present duties, and the remembrance of the happy time which had been. But the interval of blank, after the loss of her mother and during her father's life in death, had made her all the more ready to value and cling to sympathy, first from Jenny, and now from Mr Bellingham. To see her home again, and to see it with him, to show him, secure of his interest, the haunts of former times, each with its little tale of the past, of dead and gone events. No coming shadow threw its gloom over this week's dream of happiness, a dream which was too bright to be spoken about to common and indifferent ears. End of chapter 3.